Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron is up this week, though we're kind of sort of sharing this week.
Yep.
And we've got a very special episode today. So Aaron, why don't you talk about what we're bringing to the table today?
Yes, well, it's less what I'm bringing to the table and who is here to bring her book to the table. And so we've got Beth Howard here to talk with us about Song for a Hard-Hit People, which is an incredible book about cross-racial solidarity from a coal miner's daughter. Beth is the cultural strategist at Showing Up for Racial Justice and an incredible organizer who has a rich history of community organizing across the South. And she's a fellow certified Ronald Reagan hater. Yeah. So welcome, Beth.
Hey, friends. It's so great to be here and amongst my kind of those of us who belong to such a actually very big club of people who hate Ronald Reagan.
Yes. So, and I think it's growing.
It's growing by the day.
Yeah.
Growing by the day.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you with us. And we're going to jump in, and I think Aaron's going to kick us off.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get into the book and see where our conversation goes. So Song for a Hard-Hit People is Beth's memoir. So I'll introduce a little bit of it, a little synopsis of it. And it tells your story from childhood and some trauma you experienced that feels like it's rooted in some real working class experiences. And I felt some parallels between your experiences with your dad and my own dad around alcohol and other substances, which I've grown to think about as sort of self-medication in the capitalist working class experience. And then your story continues to college and graduate school, and you find organizing through direct action and research training, and then move to Florida to pursue that work. And then you go back home to Kentucky to support your dad through some health issues and learn that he's dying from cancer, which was heartbreaking and also frustrating moment. I felt the anger with you in that as well, I think. And then you find some work in local organizing in Kentucky, and then find your way to sort of showing up for racial justice through the Appalachian People's Union and help establish the Kentucky People's Union. And there's a lot more in between that I'm sure we'll get into today. But I wanted to thank you for this book and also congratulate you on it, specifically because in the book you write about how you dreamed about becoming a writer and seeing your name on the cover of books, and that other kids would read those books one day and feel comforted by them. And I think you've done that. I felt comforted by your book and consider myself a kid. And so, I wanted to say thank you and also congratulate you because, there's a lot of comfort in it alongside tears and anger and joy. And so how are you feeling about all of this as your book becomes real alongside your dream of being an author?
Yeah, thank you both for such kind words and for being readers and inviting me here. It means a lot to me. And I'm always saying lately, this little curly-haired country girl, little hillbilly child, feels really elated, just really joyful and happy. And at times it's very surreal. There are moments where I'm like, oh, this is real and it's happening, right? To hold the book in my hand for the first time, or to having conversations like this. And I just feel like in many ways the luckiest person in the world right now to have I often say you're watching someone's dreams come true, And I think also to be a working class writer, and to be somebody who wrote their book as they were also organizing full time, and seeing all the people that helped me because they believed in this story, being a part of this celebration is in that way also, and rooting for more working class writers like me to get to write books and tell their stories too.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredible. I feel like you've opened the door for that to be a reality. So I just want to add my congratulations to you as well and say thank you for such an incredible book. The way that you opened yourself up and shared your story in this beautiful way was just amazing to me. The vulnerability you brought to the book also coupled with your analysis, offered, I think, so many lessons to all of us that we can take from your book, especially given just the insane and divisive times that we're living through right now. And I said this to Aaron last week when we were excited about talking about your book, but one of the things that I appreciate so much about your vulnerability is that you made me feel so much through it. I mean, I was cheering for you in moments. You made me laugh a bunch of times. I was sad here and there. But I think above all else, I felt a lot of hope reading your book. And it's because I think you gave us a real case study, if you will, of what's possible and a real strategy to build the world that we all need and we all deserve. And so for me, you do that in a few ways throughout the book. You talk about and offer through your lived experiences and your work the importance of, and Aaron mentioned this, building that cross-race, cross-class solidarity as a critical strategy, which I think is huge. You talk about and showcase the idea of choosing solidarity over whiteness and the power and the possibility that comes from that. And the other thing I'll say is you talk about how important it is that we embrace our natural tendency to come together and to support each other and to be there for one another and to love one another, despite everything working against that, all the systems, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, all of those systems trying to separate us and keep us apart. And so I just wanted to start with that and name that and thank you for giving us a roadmap in this book. And just, again, so excited to have you and looking forward to talking with you more about this book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That really, really means a lot to me. And it feels good to have some reflection about how it's landing for people and how, people are feeling and processing it and how it could be helpful. Because that's really, I believe in art for art's sake. I love art and creativity. And I really want this book to go to work and do good work as well as inspire. And so that makes me happy to hear.
Wonderful.
Well, so jumping forward a little bit, one of my favorite points you make in the book is how to find wins in all of the parts of organizing. And so you say, quote, "The more I organized, the more ups and downs I had, the more I learned to reframe wins as being more than just hitting a number or winning a campaign. Wins are also people speaking publicly for the first time, someone meeting with their elected official about an issue they care deeply about, an organizing training that goes well, and all the smaller achievements that can happen daily." And I think that's such an important point because not all of the campaigns can be winners. And if we're only choosing campaigns that win something, then I think we're giving up a lot of ground to the parasite billionaire class and their lackeys, their cronies, their little foot soldiers. And so we have to pick things that are long odds sometimes. And to do that, I think we have to find the everyday moral victories in that work, because otherwise it's really demoralizing. So as you look on all of the organizing you've done so far, what are some of your favorite wins that aren't obvious campaign wins?
Yeah, I love this question. And one of the moments that I think about as a win, and this is with our work in Kentucky People's Union, which I talk about towards the end of the book. But, being able to bring people together, they're all coming together to work on an issue, a material issue, so housing in Eastern Kentucky. And, we have, let's say, like everyone from like Gen Z, like queer, trans members up to, elderly folks who are maybe retirees to like middle-aged people, union workers, and people with disabilities, like it's a multiracial group. And so being able to kind of look at all these people that we met in different ways, might have been knocking on the door and talking to them, canvassing, or at a community event or on a phone bank, and then starting to see them move from feeling very lonely and isolated and sometimes like, what's the point of doing any of this? Nothing's going to change. Often one of the things I usually hear is like, well, good luck organizing that meeting. No one's probably going to come, but sure, I'll be there. But, don't get your hopes up kind of thing, right? And seeing them walk into the meeting and it's full of people, right? And full of people can mean like we had 5 more people than we ever had before. And like, like that's significant. Like those are all wins. But then also seeing people building relationships with each other that are authentic in a way that I'm not sure would have happened unless we were working on a campaign together. So, for example, one of our leaders who's featured in the book, her name's Kathy. She's a character in the book towards the end. Kathy, never having a really like authentic relationship with anyone who was transgender before. And so then through our organizing, building a relationship together and like months from the time Kathy was meeting some of our younger queer members to months later, Kathy hosting a birthday party for one of our young Gen Z trans members on
Oh,
her
wow.
so those kinds of relationships are huge wins,
Yes.
right? And the way that those relationships change us. And we're kind of rowdy in Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, which I love, and kind of seeing Kathy turn into this mama bear for all of these younger queer young people in the mountains of like, if anyone messes with you, I'm gonna whoop their ass kind of,
Yeah.
And so I think those things are such huge wins. And, I was trained to be a very rigorous organizer. And so I am like, we've got to try and win, right? And like I've also kind of seen sometimes a lack of rigor or seriousness in campaigns where it's like we're not serious enough about winning, and so it's like the both and,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But especially in these long struggles, like here in Kentucky, our state has been taken over by authoritarians for a very long time. And it's very difficult to win elections or pass legislation because they've rigged the rules in their favor, which you
Yes.
kind of as a reader kind of see some of that play out in my book. And so to have these smaller wins that show that we're building power, that we're creating transformation in ourselves, in our communities, in our groups are critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. One of the things that you spoke about in that resonates with me is I was compelled by your book from the preface because you were talking about your experience organizing and canvassing with Surge way back in 2020. And so you started to talk a little bit about this. You shared this story of meeting Roxanne and her brother-in-law, Jeremy. And I loved that story completely because I thought it set the tone nicely for where you were going to go in the book. But it also highlighted who you are and what your values are and what guides you in your thinking. And so you talk about the wins being important and whatnot, but also the community is also important. And so I pulled a quote. You shared these two things that stood out to me. You said, quote, "I relied on what I knew about organizing. I kept my ears and heart open as much as I could. Instead of debating or trying to guilt them into voting, I asked more questions. Shaming is ineffective. It shuts people down. But curiosity and open-ended questions are powerful. They open people up." As they talked, I listened for what was underneath their distrust of the political process. They were afraid of losing their health care, their disability benefits, and their home. They were worried about losing their family members who were sick. Roxanne grieved the loss of her health. They were worried about their neighbors who didn't have heat in the winter. These problems had only gotten worse over the years, never better, no matter who was in office. And then a little bit later, you say, "It's worth investing in rural communities because we all want and need something different than divide and conquer racism and the destruction it brings. It's worth it because working class white people have dignity and we matter. We are worth saving too. In Georgia, we treated people like they matter. And because of that, we were able to talk to folks about their lives and about racism and move them toward taking an action alongside other working class people, white, black, and brown, to demand something better." And I just love that. Like you say, it's totally worth it because that translates to that community, that translates to those wins. And I love that. And so I don't know if hearing that story and resonating, I know you're out and about talking about your book. Like I'd love to hear about your reflections on that conversation, that experience with Roxanne and Jeremy and, all these years later and what comes to mind for you now.
Yeah, there are so many conversations that we have as organizers, countless if
Yeah.
you're really out there. And I've been out here for almost 20 years, I mean, that's a long time, a
Yeah.
lot of conversations, but there are some that stay with you, and Roxanne and Jeremy stayed with me now 5, 6 years since I talked with them. And I think for me, and what I like, one of the provocative questions that it raised for me that I kept just holding with me after I talked with them and that I still hold with me and that I feel like I raise in the book is that I knew if I could go back and work with them longer, if I could get them to organizing meetings, like I could be like, they were just ready.
Yeah.
They were right there. They were open, and there were people who maybe other groups or the Democratic Party or someone might write off, right?
Yeah.
They're Trump voters, or well, not Jeremy, but that Roxanne had been a Trump supporter at some point and was on the fence, or these kinds of people are never going to get involved and they're not a priority, right? We're just going to turn out the people we know who are already with us, or rural communities aren't even on the radar at all. Let's just focus on the blue wave we can get in the cities. But I knew, right, that if I could come back the next day or the next week and say, we have this organizing meeting, or would you be willing to come knock doors with me to talk to some of your neighbors? Let's find out if they're having the same kinds of experiences that you are. I had a feeling she would move on that, right? And then having the heartbreak of being like, there's not funding to do this work, right? There's no way to continue building this. And knowing that the Democratic Party, I saw no door knockers from the Democrat, or, I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly what you call them, but door hangers, I guess is what I'm
Yeah.
I saw no door hangers on people's doors from the Democratic Party, but I saw Republican door hangers on every single door.
Yeah.
And I was driving up hollers, and I'm from hollers, but these were not my hollers, but crossing over creeks, windy roads, and Republicans were hitting the same doors that we were. And there was no Democratic literature to be found. And so I think for me, one of the reasons that really stuck with me is what a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
We are missing out on people like Roxanne and Jeremy, who I believe are just waiting on us to knock on their door. And I think about that with my dad, who's a character in the book, and how much I feel like someone could have knocked on his door and invited him in. And so I think we're leaving so much power on the table, so many people who are just waiting on us.
Yeah. And I think, thinking about how there is no Democratic literature that you saw at all while you were out canvassing, I thought about how much we've heard from like Chuck Schumer and other Democratic leaders who have sort of written off anybody who's not a suburban or urban, even like traditional Democratic voter. And yeah, it feels like such a wasted opportunity to bring more people into a coalition, even with the very transactional way that the Democratic Party operates, where they're really just visiting you to get your vote. And there's no in-between work of figuring out what's going on for you and what are the problems we can address. It just seems like they've written those people off as we're not going to get their votes, or the people who are going to vote for us will get them. Yeah. They're people who should also have access to the governing power that's available to them and is supposed to be representing them. And so it feels like a real failure of the system, and the Democratic Party specifically, that they're not being reached out to at all.
Completely.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book is white privilege, and so I want to talk about this moment where you're reflecting on what white privilege is and what it means to you. You're in a classroom and your professor asks the group who thinks white privilege is real, and you're the only person, I think, who raises a hand, which I remember having a similar experience in grad school where we were talking about racial identity and white privilege and how that happens, and the whole room is just tense, and I'm just making eye contact and following along with the professor. And she said something, I forget what she said to me, but she named the tension. It's like, I feel like everybody's tense except for Aaron. I was like, oh, okay. So it was an interesting moment that stands out, and I felt very connected to your moment raising your hand. I felt like that was a similar experience. But one of the things that spoke to for me was, growing up in Florida and getting words to explain what I had witnessed in Florida. And that's what I really recall from that graduate school experience. And then much later, thinking about 2020 and wave after wave of reading lists for white people. And so that's kind of what you were talking about, or you sort of fast forward in the book. I think I'm fast forwarding like a couple hundred pages. And that's kind of what our podcast was born out of, is we were talking about creating a podcast, and we said, well, there's all these reading lists out there for people to do and engage with. And there's so much to learn. What does it look like if we commit to having a practice that we can invite people in to listen to that? And so that's really what this was born out of, in a way, and our friendship beyond the like learning things, right? So you say at one point, talking more about white privilege, quote, "White privilege was real. White privilege can be fragile, and we shy away from confronting race head on. But there was something more complex at play, something harder to nail down, something that felt risky to say out loud." And in that, I think you're talking about Rednecks for Black Lives in that essay, and you're naming the complexity of class in the context of white privilege, which I felt like relates back to that classroom experience in graduate school and how people didn't really feel like it was real, which is also one of the sneaky realities of white supremacy, is that white people don't notice that it's operating, and we're not supposed to. And so one of the things I've been reflecting on with your book, and also White Flank that Chandra Russo wrote and released earlier this year, which you also appear in as a character, is that white privilege as a concept, like, did some incredible work of making the invisible systemic manifestations of white supremacy real for people and tangible. But the way that we talked about it made it more of a personal moral failing of individuals than helping people understand the way that systemically this is how it shows up personally. And so I'm curious what you're thinking about in this context, and how this kind of thing, this kind of thought process influences your work now as a cultural strategist with Surge. And also, sorry for the really long walk to get to that question, but that was all the stuff that I was thinking about in that context of how we sort of metabolize what all of this means for us now.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a long walk to get at this question. So.
It's true. Yeah.
It's a long walk.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's so important. You know, I kind of look at my own political development in phases, and maybe you all can relate.
Yeah.
Like kind of being clueless but well-meaning, to then kind of getting some kind of understanding about white privilege and about oppression, and then kind of feeling like I needed to evangelize and tell everybody about it. And kind of be self-righteous about it,
Yes.
right? And then kind of moving through that phase of being like, actually, I'm trying to reach people and bring them closer to us and to meet people where they are, and kind of noticing the shortcomings of that approach in a very like micro way, but also in a very like macro, like a larger context. And so I think that moment was a really important moment in my classroom, because I had been organizing with progressive church folks. And so a lot of the white people I was organizing with were kind of mainstream white Christian denominations. So Catholic social justice kind of folks who I love, and like Episcopalians and Unitarians, who were very open to these concepts and were pretty comfortable. I was organizing in Daytona Beach, and they had nice property on the beach side, and would invite me over for dinner and have very beautiful homes and cars and, the whole thing. So a much different lived experience of a white American as my people back home.
Yeah.
And so I kind of felt that self-righteousness when people were saying, what privilege, like I live in a rundown trailer, I'm in all this debt, like, on and on and on, and things that my own family and myself have also experienced. And instead of going towards them, I kind of felt myself like stiffen up and feel superior, right? Like I'm obviously such a better white person than everybody around me. And I think that that's how that can manifest for some of us, is that we want gold stars, and we want to be the good one, right? We want to be down, and like that's a way that maybe some of our guilt and shame and not enoughness manifests of let me try and separate from these folks, and I'm one of the good ones. And then as I politically mature and study more and change more, I can really understand more about how to be in that situation and understand the way that whiteness works. And so capitalism functions the way that it does because of race. So it is designed to take white people like me, working class white people, my family, the people who I'm from, who are economically struggling and who have every reason in the world to be in solidarity with immigrants and Black people and have a history of doing so. And to break that tendency, like Damien talked about, that tendency we have to unite, to care for each other. Capitalism has to break that.
Yes.
They have to take that away from us. And so one way they do that is to take people who are suffering and economically struggling, white people, and say, we're going to give you a cookie.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to give you this tiny little thing, and it's going to feel like safety or security or superiority. And if you take it, then that means you can't hang out with your other working class siblings. They're actually the ones to blame. I mean, the immigrants are the reasons you can't have nice things, right? It's not us. But we'll make you a cop.
Yeah.
Right? We'll make you a slave catcher. We'll make you a prison guard, right? If you just come with us.
Yep.
And so I believe, because a lot of progressive, center, left, however you want to define political leanings, have not done a good enough job of organizing people like my people away from taking those cookies, falling for those lies of scarcity and moving us towards multiracial solidarity and kind of seeing that for what it is. We are losing people, right? We're either losing people to the far right or from people who are just, they're not going to be active because they're just struggling, trying to survive. And I believe that one of the ways we've tried to appeal to people is to talk to them about their white privilege.
Yeah.
And when people hear the word privilege, I just think it's a lightning word.
Yeah.
I can be in a group of all white people and someone brings up class privilege, right? And I see everybody just, I've got all these bills and I've got this debt, it is just one of those words that I think brings up a lot of shame and defensiveness. And so I think white privilege can be a way of understanding those cookies were being offered, or the way that the systems and the culture kind of, like you were saying, Aaron, like works quietly so that we don't even notice it benefiting, but we just know that it's working for us. So I rock the boat, right? Yeah. So, but I think when we talk about privilege in that way, it's just shutting people down. Yeah. And it's making them defensive and to back into their corner. And what I want to do is talk about what we actually all have to gain by being in solidarity. And that through that, we get to talk about race by saying those in power are going to tell us white people to walk away from the union. They're going to offer us a management position. They're going to try to make us, whatever thing if we leave. So we know that's coming. And so what are we going to do to prepare to not fall for it, right? And so, and to talk about it in that way. And I believe that gets people in the room, that keeps them in the campaign, that keeps them in the conversation. And then we can start to say, oh man, I was pulled over by cops and all this wild shit happened. And I know, I can say, right, I know because I'm a white lady, that didn't go sideways, right? Completely. But I think we have to get people in there. And so I think talking about shared interest of our class solidarity is the way to do that, opposed to shutting people down by kind of leading with, let's talk about your white privilege.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way that I think Surge has really taken on the more of top-down perspective of understanding what is it that we have to gain, because right now we could have healthcare and we could have all these things, but look at what the choices are being made by the people at the top. And those people at the top sometimes have a D behind their name. Yeah. A lot of times they have an R.
Exactly.
And then they're also pulling strings for people behind the scenes who are funneling money into their campaigns or their presidential libraries or whatever. And that's a different kind of class solidarity that they have than what we need to have to really build power for working class people.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and you're talking a little bit about political education there and the strategy behind that. And in one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 4, it's called Our People. You talk about the fight and the freedom struggle in the Appalachian region and how important that is for all of us and for our collective fight for liberation. And I really appreciated the connections you made between your people and folks from the southern regions of the country. And one of the biggest connection points that I think folks have is humanity, right? Mm-hmm. So the quote I pulled was, "Our region is often whitewashed, but 10% of Appalachians are people of color. When we go farther south, the southern region of the United States is the most diverse in the country, and the commonalities between Appalachia and the Black Belt region of the South, stretching through Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, are many. Our regions are often written off, underinvested in, and overlooked, but some of the most brilliant creative people who have shaped political understanding come from our regions, such as Bell Hooks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Zora Neale Hurston, Denise Giordana, Sonia Sanchez, Ann Braden, Angela Davis, Miles Horton, Don West, and Alice Walker. We are resilient people, able to stretch a dollar like a rubber band and find humor even in the most dire situations. And we are people who have turned to our deep faith traditions and to our communities to find hope. Appalachia and the Black Belt, as well as poor white Southern communities, also share similar economic conditions, consistently ranking as some of the poorest states in the country. Our state governments captured by far-right extremists, and generations of trauma in our communities from which white men, corporations, and corrupt politicians stealing our labor, exploiting our communities, and robbing our imaginations. I loved all of that. And from the shout out to those incredible organizers and activists. I mean, we love bell hooks here on this podcast in particular, but all of your work to highlight sort of the commonalities that exist and in the human condition that bonds us. And so I loved connecting that to what you were just talking about with, the political education strategy. And again, like who we are as people.
Absolutely. And I think class is the big uniter,
Yeah.
And I think, sometimes we've overcorrected around class in our past maybe, and kind of been what people would describe as a class reductionist of saying it's only class, right? And it's not about race or gender. And so we have to do both, right?
Yes.
And I do think class, we have to see ourselves as a class, because like you were saying, Aaron, the ruling class knows they're a class.
Yep.
They are very aware, and they are lining up and lining their pockets and making decisions as a class. And we have to see ourselves then as a class as well. And I think one of the most fun in organizing I ever have is to create cultural, connection between people like, Black and white immigrant people who are connecting around food and music and working class culture. One of my mentors, Jerome Scott, is just turned 80 years old, a member of, a member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and co-founder of Project South, and grew up in Detroit and now moved back to where his family was originally from in Georgia. But all that to say, we have way more in common than we don't. So much in common. And so I think that part of our role as organizers is to help us understand ourselves as a class and to create those points of connection. And I think race is one way of understanding identity or gender, but class is incredibly important. And I think that's where that kind of privilege conversation is falling flat, because I think once we see ourselves as a class, then we think, how is this system trying to divide us, and how is it using race and gender to function and keep going, and how can we as working class people, as workers, disrupt it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that and one of the things you talk about us seeing ourselves as a class, one of the things I've really appreciated, I think recently people talking about is if you're bringing home a paycheck, like you're not living off of investments or interest or whatever, or somebody else's labor, you're part of the working class. And we might have different experiences and different bills and different amount of money in the bank account, but we're all working ultimately to make ends meet. And that creates a big tent for us to understand ourselves in comparison to a ruling class of elites that are parasites.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, I think that the thing the privilege conversation also kind of sets up is that it kind of feels like sometimes I could imagine it could feel like talking to, let's say, white person living in poverty here, who's struggling with housing, and maybe is having to live in their car, or they are rationing their medicine or something, then to talk with them about, we need you to give up your white privilege.
Yeah.
It feels like you're asking people to give up what little maybe what little safety or security they have.
Yep.
And we know that that's a false safety. That idea is a lie. But it's, kind of approaching people who have so little already and saying, we want you to give up more. When in fact, like letting your whiteness go and joining the multiracial working class, look what all we gain.
Yes.
Relationships, a future, like actual shot at like healthcare for everyone, in our country. Like we actually are gaining so much by letting go of our attachment to whiteness, And so I even think a reframing of how we think about doing racial justice work as an individual person and as part of kind of a group, it should be more about abundance, less about giving up things, right?
Yeah, because there's so much available to people that we haven't tapped yet, and I think we see that in the kind of greed of the ruling class so much. Well, we're talking about application already, so let's go ahead and talk about that. This is the part of our show where we talk about how your book applies to our day-to-day lives and work. And so one of the lessons that I think is important to continue to emphasize from your book and my own experience is that we have to see ourselves in the work for collective liberation. So we have to understand what our stake is to bring us back to that shared interest point. So at one point you say, I'm past organizing white people around anti-racism because I want to be good or to do a favor for people of color. I organize white people because I want me and my family to be healthy, to be happy, to have the material things we need like housing, food, clothing, and medicine. I want my family to live long, healthy lives. I want my nieces and nephews to be their most authentic selves and to feel safe at school. I want my mother and stepfather to rest and experience ease. I want them to be able to retire instead of giving every single waking moment to working to pay bills. I want all children everywhere to have the childhood so many of us didn't get. I want every single one of them to experience love, safety, and joy. I want them to dream, to be imaginative, to play. I want them to have a future on this planet free of the terrors of man-made 1,000-year floods, hurricanes in Appalachia, and global pandemics. And I love this vision of a world beyond our current reality because I think it gives us something to latch onto and something to move forward toward. And it's a world rooted in what we all need and what so many people need and don't have access to. And it's great to see yourself in the work for collective liberation when we have a vision that's similar to that, that's like, oh, we have all this stuff to gain that we don't have, and we know we don't have because we all have stories about how we don't have those things.
Yeah. And I think about, our organizing spaces can be little microcosms where we feel that connection and joy. Like I was thinking about Kathy, for example, and a character in my book is a real person who I was talking about, hosting the birthday party for one of our younger members. Like Kathy and her husband felt pretty angry and alone in a lot of their politics and in the way that they saw the world. And all of a sudden I was kind of like, can you come to this meeting and do you want to do this thing together? And within months she was like, you all are running me ragged. Like,
Yes.
And she had this whole pack of younger people in her life who were kind of looking up to her and she's looking out for, and she's going to city council meetings and speaking.
Wow.
And those moving from isolation to community is kind of a hint at what we could have, right? It's those micro feelings that we can feel in our bodies. But I also think that it's the importance of imagination and of trying to imagine what we could have, because I do think that the ruling class and authoritarians, they want us to believe that it has to be this way. There is no other alternative, right? Data centers are inevitable and, on and on. There is no other way to be. And I think part of organizers' roles is to spark imagination and to keep our imagination very nimble and alive and find ways to share a vision so that we can really be like, this is the thing we're fighting for, right? And that we could really have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I love that quote. I remember reading that part in the book and connecting with it because you just talk about the people in your lives that you want to care for, and you want these seemingly simple things for folks to have access to healthcare and for folks to be able to live life and dream and just be. And it's simple, but as you say, the systems are designed in ways to not allow that to be. And we should be thankful for what we have. And so I love that piece. My application, I think, connects to what you were talking about earlier in terms of, the cross-race, the cross-class solidarity and organizing. At one point, you talk about organizing white people being such an important strategy for defeating fascism. And you pull a quote, you reference Anne Braden's quote. You say, organizing white people is critical to defeating fascism. As our anti-racist Southern ancestor Anne Braden said, quote, there is only one basis on which real fascism could come to the United States, and that basis is racism. To combat the far right, we have to get out there and welcome people like Roxanne into our movements. And so I just thought that was really powerful because, again, it speaks to that strategy of cross-race and cross-class organizing and solidarity being something we absolutely need. And you talked about this earlier too, but it made me think about how we have to reach out to these people, because if we don't, MAGA will, and MAGA has, and the Republicans as you talked about that story earlier. And so how do we incorporate white people into our multiracial movements, and how do we make them a part of the strategy and to help us all realize that we need each other to get to the place that we need to be? So that was one of the biggest takeaways for me from this book.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think is important that I've really learned since being at Surge is that our opponents, the far right, they talk about race all the time. They never take a break. They never walk around it, right? They are constantly talking about race, but it'll be people who are liberal, progressive, who will avoid it.
Yeah.
Right? Because we think we have to keep the peace, and that's the only way to get people who are like rural white Southerners or something, whatever demographic we want to break down, working class white people. That'll be the only way to get them, is if we just focus on, material issues, or even election protection or something. And I just think, yeah, we have seen this fail. It's not like people didn't try that before. That has been business as usual, right?
Yes.
And we have to talk about race, and it matters how we talk about it. Like the things we've been talking about, I've found are really highly effective ways to talk about race, to say, these are the ways, the landlord's going to try to divide us. They're going to use race. It has worked in all these different ways. And so here's how we have to respond, and that kind of top-down polarization, those at the top, and there's the rest of us.
Yep.
And when I'm knocking on a door, I always give this kind of example because it's so common. But, let's say we're talking about housing with renters, and I'm talking to a white renter. And sometimes we would really try to get to try to understand how they're making sense of the situation that they're in. And so if they're talking about their rent being high, or the landlord's raising the rent and they're not fixing things, and it's kind of like, why do you think that's happening? Who's to blame for that? And if they say, well, all these immigrants are moving in, right? Then it's on us to say, well, are they raising your rent? Are they in charge of the building? Those kinds of things, right? And then they're like, well, no. And it's like, well, I just talked to them and they're saying this. They're telling me the same thing that you're saying. I think it's the landlord, or I think it's this local good old boys club who's, running everything. And they're like, oh, yeah, of course. They can get there really fast. Once you leave, they'll maybe turn on Fox News or whatever, right, and revert back. And so that's why it's important that we have ongoing campaigns, and we do political education, and people meet each other and meet people that really dispel those stereotypes and that hateful messaging. But people understand they're being taken advantage of, that something is not right and they're being exploited. And so the importance of us talking to people about that and how and why that's happening, and what we have to do to kind of inoculate ourselves and our unions or our movements from the ways that they're going to use strategic racism to divide us.
Yeah, it's so important, I think, to help people see this is what they say, and this is what they do, and this is how it's worked. Because you're right, you're going to leave that door and they're going to turn on whatever media they consume, and those narratives are going to show right back up immediately because, yeah, the right wing does not stop talking about race.
Never.
Sometimes real out loud and sometimes really subtly. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I've kind of been in spaces too, I've been trying to be like, let's just talk about the lowest common denominator thing to try to bring people together. We're not going to talk about trans people. We're not going to talk about racism. We're not going to talk about ICE because that's the only way we can build this kind of broad enough movement to stop, MAGA.
Yeah.
And to me, and what other voices of us have been saying is just like, the strategy that MAGA is using is a racialized form of authoritarianism. That to get back to that Anne Braden quote, right? Like
Yeah.
they're like ICE is grabbing immigrants off the streets. They're not largely grabbing white people unless someone like Alex Pretty or
Yeah.
Renee Good,
Yeah.
right? White people who have gotten out of line. And which is a really important message for white people that we are not like, again, white supremacy is an illusion. It's not real. The minute we step out of line, the minute we're in the way, they will kill us too.
Yes.
They will kill us too. And so they're starting by targeting trans people, targeting trans kids, targeting immigrants. And what are we going to do as white people? Are we going to let them take our working class siblings off the streets? And so everything they are doing is about, like, it's strategic racism,
Yeah.
right? It's racialized. And so when we aren't being sharp strategists and stepping into that and contending for power, that's going to lose in the long term, even if we have a short-term gain, because they'll just keep playing that same play that is highly successful. And so I think we have to meet the moment by like hitting it head on.
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah, definitely.
Wow.
All right, well, let's talk about homework. So this is where we talk about how we want to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today. And so there's a book called Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections that I would love to check out at some point because, Beth, you contributed to it. And so I'd love to read that and the other things that people have contributed to that book, because it sounds like an amazing way to emphasize that if we don't mess with politics, politics will mess with us, which feels very true and real in this moment and over the last however many years of my life. And so what about you, Beth, as you move forward with the publication of the book and your own continued work with Surge as a cultural strategist, what homework do you have for yourself as a working class intellectual?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it is trying to think about, mine's more of like in practice, I guess. As I'm meeting so many people, I hope to be meeting people like you all, having conversations like this, like, being in rural Kentucky and West Virginia and North Carolina and southern places. I even get to fly to New York and Chicago, and we'll make it out to California in the fall. And so having conversations like this is my homework, is to be able to shape conversations my hope is to shape them and ask provocative questions in such a way that helps us to see ourselves more as a class. And I think for my like constant study of working class intellectualism, which I love, I really love looking at our history of doing these things, right? And trying to apply our history into our present circumstances. I was just learning more about Operation Dixie, which was the CIO's attempt to organize the South that failed because of racism. And so wanting to dig into, how has this worked in the past? How have we been foiled time and time again? And what are the times where it has worked? And so the other thing being like a time where multiracial solidarity worked was, the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is an important historical event here in our region that I talk about in the book, of the 10,000 strong multiracial redneck army of miners in 1921. It's the largest labor uprising in our country's history. And, some people might look at that example and say, well, they were defeated, right? They didn't win their union. And I was feeling kind of hopeless. It happens. Maybe not hopeless, but a little pessimistic.
Yeah.
Some days ago, kind of like sometimes being like, so many things I worked at and progress we saw has just kind of been snatched right away from us. And it's like, we can look throughout history as one long struggle. And those miners, I think about them, they could say all this stuff we did and we didn't make it, or but they just kept coming back, right? And they're with us now again and have something to say. So again, we're talking about how do we define wins?
Mm-hmm.
The struggle goes on. And so I think part of my homework is always keeping the ancestors close and thinking about how they are with us today.
I love that. Yeah. We talk about that often, about history and how important it is and how we can continue to learn from history. And those lessons are still applicable today and can help shape the work that we're doing. So it's so wonderful to hear you say that and affirm some of the conversations we've had here. All that to say, my homework is to continue to learn from you. And so I hope that as you continue to do some of that work, I know you have a blog, Working Class Love Notes. I don't know where you're going to manifest this learning that you're continuing to do. I hope it's there. I hope there's some place that I can, and our listeners can continue to learn from you, because again, the book we learned so much from, and I want to continue to do that with you and alongside you as well. So that's one piece of homework. So thank you for that. The other thing is, we've been talking a lot about class, and Aaron and I have had this conversation many times. Every week we bring something to the table, and I think some of our richest conversations have been about class. When the media touches class in some way, shape, or form, our conversations are amazing. And so I want to continue to find documentaries and books and articles that talk about class, even in some way, shape, or form. Because again, I think there's so much that we can learn from class and how we are all under that tent, as you talk about, and continue to amplify our learning in that way. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the show. So thanks, Beth, so much for being here today and for joining us and writing an incredible book that is out now as you're listening to this podcast. Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Aaron and Damien. I loved having this conversation. It's super fun and uplifting, and it's a beautiful spring day. And
yes,
there's hope in the world. There's hope in the world.
There is hope in the world. We just have to find it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring a piece from In These Times to the table for us to talk about next week. The piece that I found is called More Than a Slogan, Labor's New Gambit to Tax the Rich. It was written by Rebecca Burns and published at the end of March. And the tagline of it reads, quote, Washington State just enacted an historic millionaire tax. And as organizers set their sights on state legislatures, more could soon follow suit. And I had actually not heard about this at all. I didn't know that this was happening over in Washington State. And so I'm excited to check this piece out and to see what's going on and learn about it, but also talk about what it might mean for organizing in general and the rest of us across the country and what the possibilities could be. So I'm looking forward to talking about it with you next time.
Yeah, especially in the wake of Mayor Mamdani announcing a new property tax in New York City just the other day,
right,
where non-residential real estate will be taxed at a higher rate than other people. So people who own like a big penthouse in New York City but don't live there permanently will be taxed an additional premium on top of that. It's going to generate $500 million for New York City. So there are these different ways that we're starting to see people get creative and do things to tax the wealthy and start to understand how that wealth that has been concentrated at the top can be redistributed to all of us to actually serve all of us, in a continuation of our conversation with Beth that we just wrapped up.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that and talking about it.
Yeah, that sounds great. Can't wait to talk about that.
All right.
All right, well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.